The armor was singing. Not the way metal sings when you strike it clean. Not that bell-tone ring that Mara Vasek had learned to love in the repair bays back on Kessel Station. This was something lower, more dire. A vibration that lived in the teeth. The Vethkai ceremonial carapace, 6 interlocking plates of biocomposite alloy forged from minerals that didn't exist on any human star chart, was resonating at a frequency that made the fillings in Mara's back molars ache. She pressed her palm flat against the central thoracic plate and closed her eyes. She could feel it, the microfractures. A network of them, fine as spider silk, spreading from the impact point at the upper left pauldron all the way down through the seam junctions, threading into the interior coolant channels like cracks in old ice. If she were working on human equipment, she'd have called it catastrophic failure pending. On human equipment, she'd have red-tagged it, filed the forms, gone for coffee. This was not human equipment. This was the personal armor of Vethkai Imperatrix Solenra, second scion of the Radiant Hive, commander of the 7 expansion fleets, and the being currently responsible for the occupation of 11 human colony worlds stretching from the Kessel Corridor to the outer edge of the Velanthe Arc. Mara had never met her. She had never wanted to. She was, by training and by the very specific chain of disasters that had led her here, the most senior human structural engineer currently alive inside the Vethkai flagship Undying Chorus. Which was to say, she was the only human structural engineer currently alive inside the Vethkai flagship Undying Chorus. And in approximately 6 standard hours, Solenra was going to wear this armor into the ritual combat of ascendancy against Warmaster Orank Dao. And if the armor failed during that combat, the Vethkai political succession would destabilize, and the destabilization of Vethkai political succession would. According to every piece of intelligence the Terran remnant had managed to compile over the last 12 years of occupation, trigger the extermination protocols for all occupied human worlds as a precautionary measure. Mara Vasek stared at the microfractures. She reached into her toolkit, pulled out the resonance probe that she had modified from a Vethkai diagnostic crystal and a set of human dental picks, and got to work. The room they'd given her was a cube of pale gray composite, 10 meters on a side, which she had come to think of as the aquarium. Not because there was anything aquatic about it, but because of the way the Vethkai guards outside moved past the single observation panel in slow, deliberate patterns, pressing their 4-fingered hands briefly against the glass each time they passed, as though confirming she was still inside. She had been inside for 41 days. She had stopped counting after day 18, then resumed counting on day 23, when she realized that losing count was the first step toward losing everything else. She had a cot. She had a sanitation unit. She had approximately 400 kilograms of tools and reference materials that she had bargained, argued, and in one memorable instance wept her way into receiving. Though the weeping had been tactical, she would want anyone who asked to understand that clearly. She had a portable workbench that she had assembled herself from components that the Vethkai had provided without fully understanding their purpose, and she had, above all, the armor. The armor had arrived 11 days ago. It had been carried in by 3 Vethkai technicians who moved with the careful reverence of people transporting something sacred, which, she had since learned, they were. The Vethkai had no word for repair in the context of sacred objects. They had a word that translated approximately as renewal through skilled hands, but the skilled hands were supposed to be Vethkai hands, and the problem, the specific and increasingly urgent problem that had led to Mara Vasek being hauled out of a prisoner processing column on Kessel Station and transported 23 light-years at considerable expense, was that no living Vethkai technician understood how to work with biocomposite alloy. The last Vethkai mastersmith who had known the old techniques had died 400 of their years ago. They had written nothing down. Knowledge of that kind was passed body to body, hand to hand, in a tradition that the Vethkai called the warm chain, and that Mara privately called the single most catastrophic knowledge management failure she had ever encountered in 30 years of structural engineering. The armor had been sitting in their most sacred vault for those 400 years, and no one had touched it, and now it was cracked and the combat of ascendancy was 6 hours away. And there was a human woman in a cube room who had, in her intake interview, listed her specializations as advanced composite materials, non-terrestrial alloy systems, fracture mechanics, and anything I can hold a wrench to. That last part had been a joke. The Vethkai interviewer had not laughed. Mara had gotten the job anyway. She ran the resonance probe along the primary fracture line and watched the readout on her modified scanner. The biocomposite was doing something that normal alloys didn't do. It was responding. Not healing, the damage was too extensive for the material's self-repair capacity, but orienting toward the probe frequency, aligning its internal crystalline structure the way iron filings align to a magnet. She had spent the first 6 days after receiving the armor trying to understand what it was made of. She had spent the next 4 days redesigning her entire approach after she'd realized she was asking the wrong question. It wasn't about what the material was. It was about what the material wanted. This was the thing that the Vethkai technicians couldn't seem to grasp, even when she tried to explain it through the translation implant that buzzed in her jaw every time she spoke or listened. They kept describing the biocomposite in terms of its properties, hardness, conductivity, resonance frequency, as though it were a problem to be solved through specifications. And it was those things technically, but it was also, in ways she was still working out the mathematics for, alive. Not alive the way a bacterium is alive, not even alive the way a tree is alive. Alive the way old stone is alive, maybe. Alive in the sense that it had been grown rather than forged, and that 400 years in a vault had not killed it so much as put it to sleep, and that the right frequency, applied to the right fracture point, was not repairing the material so much as waking it up and asking it very politely to put itself back together. She adjusted the probe frequency by 3 Hz and felt the resonance change under her palm. Closer. "The Imperatrix has asked for a status report," said the guard from outside the panel. His translator rendered his voice as flat and oddly formal. The Vethkai tonal system had 17 registers, and the implants only caught about 12 of them, so everyone always sounded slightly like they were reading from a prepared statement. "Tell the Imperatrix I'll have a status report when I have something worth reporting," Mara said, without looking up. There was a silence. She could feel it being processed. The Imperatrix does not accept that response from her. A brief pause as the translator found the word technicians. "She's going to have to accept it from this one," Mara said, "because right now I'm in the middle of a fracture negotiation, and if you break my concentration, I will have to start over. And if I start over, we will not finish before the combat. And if we do not finish before the combat, the Imperatrix walks into the arena in damaged armor, and I suspect that matters more to her than my filing a report on time." Another silence, longer this time. "I will convey the substance of your response," the guard said finally. "You do that," Mara said. She heard his footsteps recede and let out a breath that she had been holding for somewhere between 30 seconds and her entire life. It was hard to tell, by this point. She had been running on 4 hours of sleep and cold reconstituted protein packs for 11 days, and there was a particular clarity that came with that level of exhaustion, a narrowing of the world to the precise dimensions of the problem in front of you, that she had learned to work inside rather than against. Her father had been a mechanic, a real one, the kind who worked on actual physical things with physical hands in a physical shop that smelled like grease and cold metal, and the specific burn-trubber scent of work that mattered. He had taught her, in the oblique way that men of his generation taught their children anything, that a machine tells you what it needs if you're quiet enough to listen. You don't fix a machine by knowing what's wrong with it. You fix a machine by understanding it well enough to speak its language. She moved the probe 4 centimeters to the left and dropped the frequency by 12 hertz, and the resonance hit it like a key turning in a lock. The biocomposite along the primary fracture line shivered. She felt it through her palm, through the bench, up into her arm and into her shoulder, and then, slowly, began to close. Mara Vasek allowed herself exactly 1 second of relief. Then she moved the probe to the secondary fracture. She had been on Kessel Station for 3 years before the occupation. She'd gone there because the work was good, and because the pay was better than anything available in the inner systems, and because, if she was being honest with herself, she had needed somewhere that was very far from the series of well-intentioned disasters that constituted her personal life back on Earth. She was 42 years old. She had been married twice. She had a daughter named Petra who was, as of the last message Mara had received before the communications blackout, studying xenobiology at the University of New Prague, and who had inherited her mother's tendency to become obsessively focused on problems to the exclusion of all surrounding context, which Mara considered both her finest legacy and her deepest parental failure. The occupation of Kessel Station had been swift, nearly bloodless, and entirely incomprehensible to the people living there in real time. The Vethkai expansion fleets did not announce themselves. They did not send diplomatic missions or ultimatums. They arrived in the kind of numbers that made resistance not just futile, but almost philosophically incoherent, 7,000 warships emerging from fold space, in a pattern that the Terran Remnant's astrophysicists later noted had the structural elegance of a mathematical proof. And within 72 hours, Kessel Station had been incorporated into the AI Radiant Hive as a provisional territory, which meant the same thing as occupied but with better branding. She hadn't tried to run. Some people had. Some of them had even made it. Mara had stayed because the station's water reclamation system had taken a hit during the one brief and spectacularly unsuccessful exchange of fire, and the water reclamation system needed someone who understood tertiary polymer seals in sub-zero environments, and she was the only person on the station who did. And so she had fixed the water reclamation system, while the Vethkai warships settled into orbital patterns overhead, and the occupation formally began. She had done it because it needed doing. That was the reason and the whole of the reason. She suspected that this was why they had come for her in the end. The intake interviews had been thorough. The Vethkai were thorough people, thorough, and in their own way methodical, though their methodology ran on principles that were alien enough to trip up anyone who approached them expecting human logic. They were not cruel. That was the thing that had surprised her most in 41 days of captivity. They were not kind either. Cruelty and kindness were both, in some sense, emotional, whether variable, contextual, subject to the pressure systems of the moment. The Vethkai operated at a temperature below weather. They were a people of deep pattern, enormous, slow, implacable pattern like tectonic movement, and what she was to them was a useful datum in a pattern they were trying to complete. She had understood this. She had decided to be useful in precisely the ways she chose to be useful, and not in any other ways. It was the only form of negotiating power available to her, and she intended to use every gram of it. The secondary fracture was trickier. It ran through one of the junction seams, the point where two of the interlocking plates joined, and the junction seam was not purely biocomposite. It was biocomposite married to a conductor mesh that she was fairly certain was Vethkai in origin rather than part of the original design, installed at some point in the last 4 centuries by a technician who had not understood what they were working with. The conductor mesh was interfering with the self-repair signal. She needed to isolate it. She pulled 3 tools from the kit and arranged them in the specific order her hands wanted them, a ritual she developed over 30 years that was not quite deliberate and not quite unconscious. The small flat probe first. Then the resonance dampener, a thing she'd built herself over the first week from parts that she doubted the Vethkai had any idea she could combine in this way. And then the micro welder, which she held the way her father had held his smallest soldering iron, 3 fingers and a thumb, light as a pencil. She worked in silence for an hour. The guards passed and pressed their hands against the panel. She didn't look up. What she had told the guards, and what the guards had certainly reported to the Imperatrix, was that she was a structural engineer. What she had not told anyone, because no one had thought to ask the right question, was that she was specifically a structural engineer who had spent 6 years of her early career working on xenoarchaeological sites. Salvage teams combing through the derelict vessels and abandoned stations of the dozen or so extinct or vanished civilizations that the expanding human sphere had stumbled across in the previous century and a half. She had worked on 3 HFY sites, a Drew ruin complex in the outer Cygnus Arm, and briefly and unforgettably, a single Vethkai vessel of pre-expansion era, a scout ship that had been drifting in an uncharted system for a period her team's dating equipment had estimated at somewhere between 600 and 900 years. That scout ship was how she knew what biocomposite alloy was. That scout ship was, in a very real sense, why she was here. She had not put any of this in her intake forms. She had listed her specializations, and she had been accurate, and she had simply not volunteered the specific experience that would have made the Vethkai understand exactly how well suited she was to this particular task. Because, and this was the calculation she had run in the 3 seconds between being pulled out of the prisoner column and deciding how to answer the first question, giving them the full picture immediately would have reduced her negotiating position to nothing. Better to be a useful tool they had to work to understand. Tools that surprised you had more leverage than tools that declared their full capability up front. Her father had told her that too, though he'd been talking about bidding on repair contracts at the time. The conductor mesh yielded. She isolated it from the junction seam in 6 minutes of careful, exacting work, cutting nothing, bending nothing, simply convincing the mesh to redirect its signal pathway around the fracture site rather than through it, a conversation, not a surgery. The biocomposite shivered again, that deep waking up sensation, and the junction seam began to close. She sat back and rolled her neck, listening to the vertebrae pop, and looked at the work she had done so far. Better, significantly better. The primary fracture was fully closed or near enough. She would need to run a full resonance sweep to confirm, but the singing had changed, the armor's voice dropping from that anxious high register to something slower and more settled. She had 4 fractures left to address. 2 of them were minor. 1 was moderate. 1 was in the pauldron, the original impact site, and it was bad. She had been avoiding the pauldron. She picked up the resonance probe and went to look at it properly. The impact that had caused the damage was, as best she could reconstruct from the fracture pattern, the result of an extremely high-velocity projectile strike. Not a Terran weapon. The fracture geometry was wrong for human ordnance. Probably a Vethkai sparring weapon, the kind used in the internal political duels that apparently happened with enough frequency that they had their own dedicated armory. Someone had struck Imperatrix Solenra's armor very hard in a very specific location, and whoever had done it had understood enough about biocomposite construction to aim for the one point where the crystalline structure was most vulnerable. The pauldron's damage wasn't incidental. It was deliberate. Mara looked at the fracture pattern for a long moment. Then she put the probe down very carefully and sat on the edge of her workbench. She thought about the things she knew. She knew that the Vethkai combat of ascendancy was a ritual succession fight. Winner takes the Imperatrix title. Loser was exiled from the hive. This was apparently considered a mercy compared to what happened to losing factions in their older political traditions. She knew that Warmester Orinkdal was the challenger. She knew that the combat was scheduled for 6 hours from now, or 5 hours and 40 minutes. She'd lost track of the exact count. She knew that Solenra's armor was damaged in a way that looked like an assassination attempt dressed as an accident. She thought about what she didn't know. She didn't know whether fixing the armor meant she was helping the Imperatrix survive a legitimate challenge, or helping her survive an assassination attempt. She didn't know whether Orinkdal was the kind of leader whose rule would mean better or worse conditions for the 11 occupied human worlds. She didn't know the Vethkai power structures well enough to know which outcome helped humanity more. She thought about Petra, doing xenobiology at New Prague. She thought about the water reclamation system on Kessel Station that she had fixed while the warships settled overhead. She thought about the thing her father had said once, not about engines, this time about something else, when she was 9 years old, and had asked him whether they should fix old Mrs. Denye's car, knowing that Mrs. Denye was not a good person. He had put down the wrench and looked at her with the specific expression he had that meant he was going to say something that would stay with her longer than he intended. "Baby," he had said, "I fix what's in front of me. The rest is above my pay grade." She picked up the resonance probe. The pauldron was the hardest thing she had ever worked on. The fractures here were not the clean propagating cracks of structural overload. They were shattered, a dozen fracture planes radiating from the impact point in a pattern that looked, under the probe's readout, like a catastrophic crystalline detonation. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. The biocomposite here wasn't sleeping. It was fragmented, its internal coherence broken into pieces that no longer communicated with each other, each splinter running its own degraded self-repair process that was actually interfering with the others, the material's own survival instinct becoming the obstacle to its survival. She understood this problem, not mechanically, though she understood it mechanically too, but in her bones. The thing the material was doing was the thing she had spent the first year after her second marriage doing, trying to fix itself and making it worse. She put the probe down. She picked up the resonance dampener. She spent 12 minutes mapping the interference patterns, cataloging every counterproductive repair signal, building in her head the precise topology of the chaos in the pauldron. Then she picked up the probe again and she began, one by one, to quiet the noise. It was not a process she could describe in technical terms that would mean anything to someone who hadn't worked with biocomposite. It was closer to, she thought about this, once in the middle of the third hour, when her hands were steadier than her mind, closer to crisis counseling than to engineering. She was not telling the material what to do, she was helping it hear itself. At some point during the third hour, the outer panel opened. Not a guard this time. Something different in the sound of the footsteps, heavier, more deliberate, with the particular resonance of someone who is accustomed to rooms changing when they enter them. "You are the human engineer." The translator rendered the voice as flat, as always, but even through the translation she could hear the registers underneath, the multiple simultaneous overtones that the Vethkai used for formal address, 17 tonal layers compressed into something her implant turned into mere words. She did not look up. "I am," Mara said. "You have been working for 9 hours without cessation. The job needed 9 hours. You were given 11 days. I spent the first 10 days learning the material," Mara said. "I'm spending today fixing it." She moved the probe 2 millimeters. "If you're the Imperatrix, I'd prefer it if you didn't touch anything." The silence that followed had a different quality than the guard's silences. It was a silence that was doing several things at once. "I am Solenra," the voice said. "I figured," Mara said. "The guards don't walk like that." "Like what?" "Like the floor is doing you a favor by being solid." Another silence. She could have sworn she heard something in it that she couldn't name, not amusement. The Vethkai didn't laugh, but something adjacent. Something in the 17 registers that her implant had flattened out. "How does my armor fare?" Solenra said. "Better than it did 9 hours ago," Mara said. "The primary fractures are closed. The junction seams are stabilized. I'm working on the pauldron now." "And the pauldron?" Mara paused. The probe hummed in her hand. "Someone tried to kill you," she said. The damage pattern isn't from a training strike, it's targeted. The impact geometry is designed to compromise the structural coherence of the crystalline lattice without leaving obvious external damage. Whoever did it knew biocomposite architecture. Specifically the pre-Reformation variants, the old design, not the modern replications. She kept her voice even, reporting, the way she reported on structural assessments to clients who needed the bad news in a form they could act on. My best estimate is that whoever struck your armor in your last training session did it with a modified weapon designed to deliver a crystalline disruption charge on impact. The external mark is minimal. The internal damage is severe. The silence this time was the longest yet. You have repaired it, Solenra said. It was not quite a question. I'm repairing it. I have approximately 2 hours of work left on the pauldron, and then a full resonance sweep of the entire carapace. You said you have a combat in. Mara glanced at her counter. 4 hours and 50 minutes. You'll have your armor. You will tell no one of this analysis. I have no one to tell, Mara said. I'm in a cube. There are others who would receive a message, if you found a way to send one. I'm aware. The probe moved, and the pauldron's fragmented crystalline structure quivered with something that was almost recognition. I'm not interested in your politics. I'm interested in this fracture. She heard Solenra take a breath. The Vethkai breathed differently, a double-cycle respiration that always made them sound faintly like they were sighing. And the tone registers in that breath were complex enough that even through the translation implant she could catch the edges of something like calculation, something like reassessment. You were taken from a prisoner column on Kessel Station, Solenra said. You remained there during the occupation. You repaired the station's water systems. Yes. You did not attempt to evacuate. The water system needed fixing. Many of your kind would have left. Many of my kind did leave, Mara said. I'm not criticizing them for it. The station had 6,000 people depending on that system. The system needed someone who understood tertiary polymer seals in sub-zero environments. That was me. She shifted her grip on the probe. If it had been someone else, they would have stayed. That's how it works when it works. You believe this. I know this. I've watched it happen for 30 years. Humans aren't special at most things. We're specifically, stubbornly, sometimes catastrophically good at staying with the problem in front of us. It's not heroism. It's closer to, she paused, looking for the word stubbornness on behalf of the specific thing that needs doing right now. The probe found the last intact crystalline domain in the pauldron's fragmented lattice, a small cluster, deep in the composite, that had somehow maintained coherence through the whole assault, and Mara felt the resonance connect, felt the biocomposite self-repair signal cascade outward from that intact core like a wave, organized now, directed. The chaos of the material's internal confusion resolving into something that knew what it was supposed to be. The Vethkai have a concept, Solenra said from somewhere behind her. It does not translate directly. The closest approximation in your language is the shape of the one who holds. She paused. The belief is that objects take on the pattern of those who care for them. Sacred objects especially. The armor carries the warm chain, the knowledge passed hand to hand through generations. It has not been touched by a living practitioner in 400 years. Another pause. You have touched it with skilled hands. Whatever it is that you are, whatever your kind is, the armor knows you have treated it with care. Mara did not say anything for a moment. The probe moved. The pauldron continued to close. Thank you, she said finally. That's thank you. She worked in silence for another hour and 40 minutes. Solenra did not leave. She stood somewhere behind and to the left, still enough that Mara occasionally forgot she was there, and then remembered again, and the remembering was not uncomfortable. It was, if she was honest, something like having her father stand in the doorway of the garage while she worked on her first solo engine rebuild at 15. Not helping, not interfering, just present. When Mara set down the resonance probe for the last time, her hands were trembling, not from fear, from the specific exhaustion of very fine work done for a very long time. She flexed her fingers, feeling the ache in the joints, and looked at the pauldron. The fractures were closed. Not perfectly. There were residual stress patterns she could see in the readout that would never be fully resolved, artifacts of the crystalline disruption, permanent records of what the armor had survived. She could have kept working, tried to smooth them out. She had decided, somewhere in the last hour, not to. The armor had been through something, and the armor would carry that. She thought her father would have agreed with the decision. She ran the full resonance sweep. It took 23 minutes. She watched the readout with the focused attention that was, at this point, the only mode she had left. The biocomposite sang, not in pain anymore. Steady and settled, the voice of a structure that knew its own integrity. "It's done," she said. Solenra stepped forward, past Mara, and stood before the armor. The Vethkai Imperatrix was taller than she'd imagined, 2.5 meters, the characteristic rangy build of the higher caste Vethkai, with the four-fingered hands and the secondary joint in the forearms, and the eyes that caught light at angles human eyes didn't. She looked at the armor for a long time without speaking. Then she reached out and laid one hand, palm flat, against the central thoracic plate. The way the guards pressed their hands against the panel of Mara's room, the way you touch something to confirm it's still there. "You asked for many things during your time here," Solenra said. "Tools, materials, reference data. I asked for what I needed. You did not ask for your freedom." Mara looked at her workbench, at the toolkit she had assembled over 41 days from parts and components and modified instruments and sheer, intractable engineering problem-solving, at the resonance dampener she'd built from scratch, at the dental picks. "I'm asking now," she said. The combat of ascendancy took place 4 hours and 10 minutes later, in the arena at the heart of the undying chorus. Mara did not see it. She was in the aquarium, still in the aquarium, because freedom, it turned out, was a negotiation rather than an event, and the negotiation had several stages, and stage 1 was simply being moved from the column marked prisoner to the column marked something else. She watched the ceiling of her cube and listened to the distant vibration of the Vethkai ritual drums that carried through the composite hull of the ship, a sound like the heartbeat of something enormous and very old. She thought about Petra. She thought about the occupied worlds, 11 of them, stretched across the Kessel corridor and the Velanthe arc, 60 million humans going about there surviving under the shadow of the radiant hive. She thought about what Solenra had said about the shape of the one who holds. She thought about whether she had done the right thing. She ran the calculation the way she always ran it, practically, with the data she had. An imperatrix she had spoken to and found to be, if not human, at least not monstrous. An alternative represented by whoever had arranged the crystalline disruption charge in the pauldron. An opponent willing to assassinate the opposition through a weapon designed to look like an accident. She thought about which kind of power you want to repair, and which kind you let break. She thought about the armor singing in pain and then, under her hands, finding its voice again. The drum stopped. An hour later, the panel opened and a different guard, not one she recognized, stood in the opening and said, in the flat translated register, that the imperatrix had prevailed and that engineer Vasek was to be transferred to a diplomatic holding facility and that she was to bring her tools. Mara stood up. She picked up her toolkit. She looked around the aquarium for what she hoped was the last time. The cot, the workbench, the sanitation unit, the 41 days of survival and calculation and very fine work. And she felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but lived somewhere between them, in the territory of having done what needed doing with what you had. She took her tools and she walked out. The Vethkai ship was vast. She had known this abstractly for 41 days, from the scale of the corridors she'd been walked through in restraints when she arrived, from the distant vibrations that told you the structure around you was truly enormous. Walking it freely was different. The corridors were 2 stories tall and lit in the amber gold of the Vethkai's primary visual spectrum, and the air carried the faint mineral smell she associated with the biocomposite, not unpleasant, like clean stone after rain, and everywhere were Vethkai who looked at her with the frank, unguarded assessment of people who had been told to expect something, and were now calibrating their expectations against reality. She looked back at them with equal frankness. She had learned in 41 days that the Vethkai read fear the way humans read aggression, as a signal to escalate. She was not afraid. She was exhausted and aching, and she had not slept in something like 22 hours, and her fillings still ached slightly from the biocomposite's resonance. And she was, by any reasonable measure, the least threatening thing in this corridor. She walked like it wasn't the floor doing her a favor by being solid, the way Solenra had walked into the aquarium, and she had no idea if that meant anything to the Vethkai she passed, but it meant something to her. The diplomatic facility was 3 levels up and 2 sections forward, and she registered this with a professional appreciation she was too tired to suppress, significantly better designed than the aquarium. 2 rooms, not 1. A sleeping alcove with a temperature control. A meal console that appeared to be stocked with human-compatible food, actual food, not reconstituted protein. A communications terminal, unactivated, its status light dark. The guard who had brought her here stood in the doorway. "The communications terminal," Mara said. "When does it go live?" "That is a negotiation for the Imperatrix's diplomatic division," the guard said. "I'd like to start that negotiation." The guard's secondary eyelids closed briefly, the Vethkai equivalent of a blink. "I will relay the request." "Tell them," Mara said, setting her toolkit down on the table that was her new workbench, "that I have a daughter at the University of New Prague. That's where we should start." The guard left. The door did not lock, or, if it did, it locked from the inside, which was not a difference she was going to take for granted, but was a difference she was going to note. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. The mechanic's hands, her father's hands, the hands that had spent 11 days waking up a piece of 400-year-old sacred armor that no living expert in the known galaxy understood, that had tracked microfractures in material that didn't exist on any human star chart, that had turned 3 sets of dental picks and a diagnostic crystal into a resonance probe that worked. She thought about the 60 million people on 11 worlds. She thought about water reclamation systems and tertiary polymer seals. She thought about the shape of the one who holds. She thought about how you negotiate from a position of having something the other side needs. She opened her toolkit. She took out the resonance dampener she'd built from scratch. She set it on the table. She'd been thinking in the back of her mind for the last 9 hours about something she'd noticed in the biocomposite's crystalline structure during the pauldron repair, a secondary resonance pattern very faint that she hadn't had time to investigate. She had the data. She had the equipment. She had, apparently, time. She picked up the dental picks. She started to work. 2 weeks later, the communications terminal came online. She was in the middle of a different problem. The Imperatrix's diplomatic division had presented her with 3 damaged artifacts from the same vault as the armor, all biocomposite, all requiring the specific skills she was not supposed to have but demonstrably did. When the terminal pinged and the status light went from dark to green, she looked at it for a moment. She crossed the room and sat down in front of it and entered her daughter's contact ID from memory, every digit, the way you remember a thing you've memorized through love rather than discipline. She waited. The connection took 40 seconds. Then Petra's face appeared on the screen, 23 years old, her mother's eyes, her father's stubborn jaw, currently in the middle of what appeared to be a xenobiology laboratory, surrounded by specimen containers and data tablets and the organized chaos of someone who was deeply, happily inside a problem. "Mom," Petra said. Her voice was careful the way you make your voice careful when you've been afraid for a long time and you're not sure yet if you're allowed to stop. "Mom, where are you? We lost contact when are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm okay," Mara said. "I'm on a Vethkai ship. I'll explain it all, but I want you to know I'm okay first." She paused. "I'm working." Petra stared at her. "You're working?" "On a Vethkai ship." "It's a long story." "Mom," Petra's voice cracked on the word, and she seemed to decide something in the next 2 seconds, some decision about not being careful anymore. "Are you a prisoner?" Mara thought about it. She thought about the cube and the panel and the 41 days. She thought about the door that locked from the inside. She thought about Solenra's hand on the thoracic plate. She thought about 6 artifacts on her work table and a communications terminal that had come online exactly when the Imperatrix's people had said it would, not before, not after, but when. "I'm a consultant," she said, "with a complicated contract." Petra laughed. It was a wet sound, still afraid around the edges but real. "That is so completely you." "I know," Mara said. "Tell me about your work." She listened to her daughter talk about xenobiology and specimen collection, and a professor who didn't understand cellular membrane dynamics, and a classmate who was either going to be her best friend or her nemesis. She hadn't decided. She listened, and she watched Petra's face, and she thought about the shape of the one who holds. She thought about what it meant to fix something. She thought about how it was never really about the object. It was about the fact of care, and the willingness to stay with the problem, and the understanding that the material, whatever the material was, metal or stone or occupied worlds, or a relationship between species who had every reason not to trust each other, tells you what it needs if you're quiet enough to listen. Outside the diplomatic facility, the undying chorus sailed through fold space toward the occupied worlds. 60 million people were waiting there, going about their surviving, not knowing yet that the Imperatrix who ruled them had walked into an ascendancy combat in armor that had been repaired by the only person in the galaxy who knew how, and had won. Mara did not know what that would mean. She was not a diplomat or a politician or a strategist. She was a structural engineer who fixed things. She had fixed what was in front of her with what she had, and the rest was, as her father had said, above her pay grade. She was going to try to bring the pay grade down. She was going to do it the way she did everything, with the right tools and patience, and the specific human stubbornness of staying with the problem until the problem solved. On the table behind her, the resonance dampener sat next to the first of the 3 new artifacts, and above the artifact's data readout, a single line of numbers blinked in the amber gold light. Crystalline coherence, rising. She finished the call with Petra. She sat in the silence for a moment, listening to the ship. Then she picked up the dental picks, and she went back to work. The 3rd artifact was a gauntlet. Not a glove, not a bracer. A full articulated gauntlet that extended from the fingertips to the mid-forearm, and it was different from the armor in ways that took Mara 3 full days to understand. The armor had been sleeping. The gauntlet was doing something else. She kept coming back to it between the other 2 pieces. A cracked pauldron from a different set, less complex than Solenra's, and a ceremonial chest piece that had suffered simple thermal stress damage from improper storage. And every time she came back to the gauntlet, she had to start her analysis over, because it persisted in not being what she expected. On the 4th day, she asked for more reference data. The Vethkai Diplomatic Division sent a junior liaison named something that translated as Orcs, a younger Vethkai than anyone she'd dealt with so far, lean even by Vethkai standards, with the quick secondary eyelid movements she was beginning to read as the equivalent of raised eyebrows. Orcs arrived with 2 data crystals and stood in the doorway of her facility looking at the workspace she'd constructed over the past 2 weeks with the undisguised fascination of someone who hadn't been briefed to conceal their reactions. You moved the furniture, Orankai said. I needed more workbench space. The table in the corner was decorative. It was designed as a pause, as a seating arrangement. It's better as a workbench. She took the crystals and slotted them into the reader she'd gotten from the AI technical supply, which was not designed for Vethkai data crystals. She'd modified it on day 3 of her residency in the diplomatic facility, a modification that the supply officer had not commented on but that she suspected had been noted. I have questions about the gauntlet. I am not authorized to answer questions about. I know you're not authorized. I'm not asking for authorization. I'm telling you what I'm going to need before I can work on it. She pulled up the gauntlet's resonance scan on the screen. The biocomposite in this piece is different from the armor. The crystalline structure has a secondary orientation that isn't present in the other pieces. It's not damage. It's intentional. Someone designed this piece to resonate at a specific frequency that the others aren't built for. She turned to look at Orankai. What does the gauntlet do? Orankai's secondary eyelids flickered in rapid succession. That information would need to come from the Imperatrix herself, the liaison said. Then set up a meeting, Mara said, turning back to the screen. There was a silence. Engineer Vasek, Orankai said. She heard in the translated flatness of the voice something that was working hard not to be amusement. You are aware that you are currently a guest of the Hive, under a conditional diplomatic arrangement, and that the Imperatrix is. I'm aware of all of that, Mara said. I'm also aware that I'm the only person in the known galaxy who can work on these objects, and that the Hive has 7 more of them in the vault, and at least 2 of them are going to need significant intervention in the next decade based on what the resonance data suggests. I'm not being presumptuous. I'm managing a maintenance schedule. She paused. Also, the Imperatrix is the one who walked into my workspace uninvited and stood behind me for 2 hours, so I know she's capable of attending meetings. The secondary eyelids did something complicated. I will relay the request, Orankai said, and she could have sworn there was something in the translated syllables that a human would have called trying not to smile. The meeting happened the next morning, which was, by Mara's count, day 30 of her tenure in the diplomatic facility. Solenra arrived without announcement, no guard, no retinue, which Mara had been told by Orankai was unusual to the point of almost being a statement in itself. The Imperatrix wore a formal overrobe in the deep amber gold that seemed to be her color, the fabric moving with the particular weight of something that was probably not fabric in any material sense Mara would have recognized. And she walked with the floor doing you a favor quality that Mara had clocked on first hearing her footsteps in the aquarium. Mara was already at the workbench. She did not stand. She had thought about standing and decided that standing would have been a miscalculation, not out of disrespect, but because the relationship they had established was built on a specific kind of mutual directness that standing would have complicated. The gauntlet, Solenra said, looking at the piece on the workbench. The gauntlet, Mara confirmed. Tell me what it does. Solenra considered this for a moment in the way she had, the deep, tectonic patience of someone for whom a pause was not an absence of communication, but a form of it. The gauntlet is a resonance amplifier, she said. It was made by the same mastersmith who made my armor. It is, in the closest translation available to me, a tool for conducting the warm chain. The mastersmith who carried the knowledge, who held the knowledge in their hands, would wear the gauntlet when passing that knowledge to the next practitioner. The resonance of the biocomposite would, in theory, carry the transmission, make the learning more complete. The warm chain was passed this way for generations. She paused. Until the last mastersmith died without a student. Mara looked at the gauntlet. She looked at the secondary orientation in the crystalline structure, the specific frequency it was designed to resonate at. She looked at her own hands, the grease and the metallic dust, the dental pix marks on her fingertips, the ache in the joints from 11 days of fine work and 30 years before that. It's tuned to a specific pair of hands, Mara said. It was not a question. Yes. The hands that made it. Yes. And after 400 years, no living AI has hands with that resonance. Solenra looked at her for a long time. The 17 tonal registers of Vethkai formal address were present in her silence. No, she said. Mara turned the gauntlet over in her hands. It was lighter than it looked. The biocomposite always was, and warm, and she could feel the secondary orientation trying to match itself to her, the way it had been trying for 4 days, the gentle, persistent seeking of something that had been waiting 400 years for the right frequency. She thought about the warm chain. Knowledge passed hand to hand, body to body, generation to generation, the one form of transmission the Vethkai had trusted enough to use for their most sacred techniques. She thought about a mastersmith dying without a student and 400 years of silence after. She thought about what it meant that the gauntlet was asking her hands for the resonance it needed. She thought about her father, standing in the doorway of the garage. I need you to understand something, Mara said, and I need you to be honest with me about whether you can accept it. Because if you can't, this conversation ends here and we go back to the artifacts being fixed one at a time as long as I'm alive, and that's the whole of it. Solenra waited. The gauntlet is asking for my frequency, Mara said. Not a Vethkai frequency. Mine. Whatever the original mastersmith had in their hands, whatever resonance they built this piece to carry, it's not in any living Vethkai practitioner. Maybe it never was in exactly this form. Maybe the biocomposite doesn't care about species. Maybe it cares about something else, attention, or care, or the specific quality of hands that have spent decades learning to listen to what materials tell them. She set the gauntlet down. I don't know what that means for your warm chain. I don't know what it means for your traditions or your succession politics or your understanding of what kind of being is supposed to carry sacred knowledge. I know what the resonance data says. The silence was very long. What do you require? Solenra said. And that was the question that opened everything. What Mara required was 2 things. The first was contact access, not just a single communications terminal, but a diplomatic channel that could carry encoded messages to the Terran Remnant's provisional government, with the kind of bandwidth that could move actual information, the kind of information that mattered for 60 million people trying to navigate life under an occupation that was now, based on everything she was learning, considerably more negotiable than anyone on either side had previously understood. The second thing was time, an open-ended residency, not indefinite imprisonment with a nicer room, but a genuine working arrangement in which she was a consultant with the standing to ask questions and receive answers and push back when the answers were incomplete. These were not the terms she led with. These were the terms she arrived at through a negotiation conducted over 6 days, with Orankai as her primary interlocutor and Solenra appearing twice more in ways that were nominally informal and were, Mara suspected, anything but. She had learned in the time she'd been here that the Vethkai conducted their most important business obliquely, not because they were deceptive, but because directness in high-stakes situations was considered, in their culture, a sign of insufficient confidence in one's position. You only stated terms directly when you were so secure in your power that subtlety was unnecessary. Since she was not, in any conventional sense, secure, she had spent 6 days being patient and specific, and allowing the negotiation to move at the pace it needed to move, which was the pace of deep pattern and tectonic shift. On the 6th day, the diplomatic channel came online. On the 7th day, she put on the gauntlet. It was a deliberate act. She had thought about it for 48 hours before doing it, running the mechanical risks, the structural risks, the symbolic risks, and she had concluded that it was the right move for reasons that she could not entirely articulate but that felt, in the way that her best engineering decisions always felt, like a structure finding its own equilibrium. She put on the gauntlet and the biocomposite settled around her hand with the specificity of something recognizing what it had been waiting for, and the secondary resonance orientation fired, and she felt it move up her arm and into her shoulder, and through the center of her chest like a key, turning in a much larger lock than she had imagined. She did not know what the warm chain felt like from the inside for a Vethkai practitioner. She suspected she would never fully know. What she felt was, information was the wrong word. Not exactly sensation and not exactly knowledge. More like suddenly being able to hear a frequency that had always been there. Like her father's garage all those years ago, the machine telling you what it needs if you're quiet enough to listen, but expanded. Every artifact on her workbench, every piece of biocomposite in the room, every resonance pattern she'd been working with for 30 days, all of it clarifying, the noise resolving into signal, the fragments cohering into something that had structure and direction and meaning. She stood there for a full minute, perfectly still. Then she took the gauntlet off, very carefully, and set it on the workbench. Orcs, who had been standing in the doorway. Mara had not told the liaison to be present, but she had not told them not to be, and Orcs had apparently arrived at the same conclusion about presence and doorways that Solenra had arrived at on a different morning in a different room, made the complicated secondary eyelid movement that Mara was now reading as something between wonder and recalibration. "What did you experience?" Orcs asked. "I don't have the vocabulary for it yet," Mara said. "I'll need vocabulary. I can arrange language resources." "I know," she looked at the gauntlet, "but first I need to write a message." The message went through the diplomatic channel. It was addressed to the Terran Remnant Provisional Government at Kessel Station, for the attention of whoever was currently running the diplomatic liaison office. She didn't know who that was, having been out of contact for something approaching 4 months by now, and it was not, in its first version, diplomatic. The first version was 23 lines of pure engineering report. "This is the situation. This is what I have done. These are the structural properties of the relationship as I understand them. These are the load-bearing elements, and these are the failure points, and here is what I believe can be built on this foundation if we approach it correctly." She rewrote it 4 times. The final version was 8 lines. It said, "I am on the undying chorus. I am well. I have established a working relationship with the Imperatrix Solenra that I believe has potential significance for the occupied territories. I am not a diplomat and I am not pretending to be one. I am an engineer, but I have been working with the biocomposite, and I have learned something that I think matters, and I need people with the right skills to help me translate what I know into terms that can be used. Please find me a diplomat who isn't afraid of technical work. I'll supply the rest." She sent it. The reply took 6 days, which was fast by any standard she could think of, which told her that the Terran remnant was either better organized than she'd expected or more desperate than she'd hoped, or most likely both. The reply was from a woman named Counselor Irina Abui, and it was 3 lines, received. "What do you need? We will provide it." Mara read it twice. She recognized in those 3 lines something she understood, the directness of people who were out of options and had decided to stop pretending they weren't. She had been there herself, on Kessel Station, watching the warship settle into orbit while the water reclamation system broke. You get to a point where the performance of dignity costs more than you have, and you put it down and you say simply, "What do you need? We will provide it." She wrote back, "I need a xenolinguist who can handle 17 tonal registers and a materials scientist who has worked with pre-expansion Vethkai artifacts, if any such person exists. If neither exists, send me someone who is willing to learn. I have begun something here that I do not know how to finish alone, but I think it matters." She sent it. She went back to the workbench. The gauntlet was there, and the cracked pauldron from the secondary set, and the 3 other artifacts in the queue, and outside the viewport the stars moved past in the slow, deliberate patterns of a ship traveling at expansion speed toward a system she'd find on a star chart, toward 60 million people going about their surviving. She picked up the dental picks. There was work to do. 12 weeks after Mara Vasek had been pulled from a prisoner processing column on Kessel Station, the Vethkai Radiant Hive issued a document that had no direct precedent in either AI or human political history. It was not a peace treaty. Neither side was ready for that word, with all its finality and its weight. It was not a ceasefire, because the occupation had technically never involved active combat after the initial 72 hours. It was something the Vethkai called, in the 17 Register formal register, the recognition of mutual pattern, a term that Orankai, working with the xenolinguist the Terran remnant had sent, a woman named Dr. Kezia Amara who had 2 doctorates, and the ability to drink cold coffee while solving impossible problems, which made her Mara's favorite person she'd met in months, translated into the closest human equivalent as, "We see you seeing us." It was not enough. Everyone knew it was not enough. 60 million people were still on occupied worlds. Human political autonomy was still severely curtailed across the Kessel Corridor and the Velanthi Arc. The structural inequalities of the occupation had not been dismantled but had been named, which was not the same thing but was not nothing. Mara had not negotiated the document. She had provided the technical foundation for the conversations that led to the document, conversations about the biocomposite, about the warm chain, about what it meant that a human engineer's hands resonated with a 400-year-old Vethkai artifact in ways that no living Vethkai's hands did, about what that suggested for how the universe understood the boundary between species, about the possibility that the deep pattern the Vethkai organized their civilization around included. As a structural element, interactions with beings very different from themselves. She had not made any of these arguments. She had shown the resonance data and let the arguments make themselves. On the day the recognition of mutual pattern was transmitted to both governments, Solenra came to the facility without announcement, as she always did. Mara was at the workbench, working on a piece she had not been given, a small fragment of biocomposite she had requested permission to experiment on, a piece without sacred status, a piece she wanted to understand in a different way than the preservation and repair work demanded. She was trying to understand what the material could become, rather than what it had been. It was the next engineering problem. It seemed like the important one. Solenra stood beside the workbench and looked at what she was doing. "You are changing it," the Imperatrix said. "I'm trying to," Mara said. "I don't know yet if it wants to change." She set down the probe. "Is there something you need?" "The document has been transmitted." "I heard." "It is not enough," Solenra said. "No," Mara agreed. "The shape of it is correct. The weight of it is insufficient." The Imperatrix's 4-fingered hand rested on the edge of the workbench, not quite touching the biocomposite fragment. "There are members of my council who believe that the recognition legitimizes the occupation by acknowledging it. There are members of your remnant government who believe that it legitimizes the hive by acknowledging it. Both positions have structural merit." "I know," Mara said. "The path forward requires more than a document." "I know that too." She looked at the fragment. "It requires time, and it requires people willing to keep showing up to the work. The document is a foundation. Foundations are the part that has to hold the weight of everything that gets built on top of them." She paused. "I know something about foundations." The secondary eyelids moved slowly, not the rapid flicker of recalibration or the complicated micro-expression of someone trying not to smile. A slow, deliberate movement. Mara was still learning the full vocabulary, still extending her grasp of the registers that her implant flattened out, but she thought she was reading this one correctly. She thought she was reading it as, "I believe you." "There is a second vault," Solenra said, "deeper than the first. The artifacts there have not been catalogued in living memory. We do not know their condition." Mara looked at the fragment. She looked at her hands. "We're going to need better lighting," she said. Solenra made a sound that the translation implant rendered as nothing, a tonal register that didn't map to any human equivalent, and walked toward the door. "I will have it arranged," the Imperatrix said and left. Mara sat for a moment in the quiet of the room, with the biocomposite fragment on the table before her, and the stars moving past the viewport and the weight of 60 million people somewhere out there, going about their surviving, not knowing yet what was being built in a workroom on a Vethkai ship by a human woman with dental picks and a resonance probe and the specific, incorrigible, irreducible human quality of staying with the problem until the problem resolved. She was tired. She was aching. She had been tired and aching for 12 weeks, and she would be tired and aching for as long as this took, which was going to be a long time, which was fine. Long was fine. Long was what it took when it mattered. She picked up the probe. She put it down again. She picked up the communications terminal stylus instead and pulled up a blank message form, addressed it to Petra in New Prague, and wrote, "Still here. Still working. I miss you. Tell me something good." She sent it. She picked the probe back up. The biocomposite fragment hummed, very quietly, in the key of something almost like hello.